Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and one of the common, not necessarily complaints, but criticisms about Tolkien is that his heroes are all perfect goody two-shoes, and his villains are all absolute moral, disgusting reprobates, and there's really no gray area in between. I think any more than casual reader knows that this is bogus, but and of course this kind of thing goes around all the time. You'll see people talking about this every now and then, and people will bring up various different aspects of the story that show why this is false. And one of the things that is kind of true about it is that Tolkien does deal in moral absolutes. There is such a thing as an absolute good and an absolute evil, and there are characters who clearly fall on one side or the other of the spectrum, but none of them are without moral flaws, and we can see this if we look carefully at each different character. So what I want to do is look at not all of Tolkien's characters, but certainly a fair number of the ones that tend to get thought of as being the main heroes of the story, and look at what their moral failings are, because each one of them definitely does have one. And it's also interesting because we can look at their moral failings and see why they're a natural fit for their character as well, which makes for an interesting character study, but also shows up just how good of a writer Tolkien is in terms of creating characters as whole persons with real personalities that fit together. So to start off, let's look at Sam Gamgee, who is the, according to Tolkien himself, chief hero of the story. Sam, of course, is mainly praised for a number of very good qualities, such as humility, loyalty, just dogged perseverance, and, just being grounded. He's a hobbit. He's not in, some state of thinking he's high and mighty. He's not, airy fairy. He's not, there's nothing about him that's really easy to knock him out of his path because he's so grounded. And that's part of what leads to his problem, because he's also extremely provincial in the most ridiculous ways. Samwise will be critical of almost anybody who lives outside of his little tiny scope of the Shire, and think of them as strange at best, dangerous, or even evil at worst. He doesn't trust much of anybody outside of, a 5 miles radius of Bag End. And we could see this multiple times throughout the story. We see it most obviously, of course, in a case like Strider, who admittedly comes across as dangerous the first time you see him from almost any perspective, but he's also this way about a lot of other people. Now, he does have kind of one exception to this, which is elves. He thinks elves are awesome and, just doesn't really think anything bad about elves in general, which is partially because he grew up on stories from Bilbo talking about how amazing elves are. But we do see that throughout the story, he will be suspicious of not only Strider, he will be suspicious of Faramir, he will be especially suspicious of Smeagol Gollum, he will be suspicious of even other hobbits. And one great example of this is Farmer Maggot, who we are told from the storyteller's perspective that he doesn't see how Farmer Maggot or anybody who beat his master in the past could be good. But then, he kind of warms up to him as he gets fed food and given beer. So it's not that Sam's failing is something that can't be overcome, and that's part of what makes the heroes the heroes. They have failings, but they can overcome those failings and correct themselves. And Sam does this with Faramir, too. Faramir, of course, he starts out fairly suspicious of, especially because when he first wakes up, he sees Faramir basically interrogating Frodo like he's in a police interrogation room, and this immediately gets him kind of huffy. But as Faramir proves his own character over time, Sam will eventually come around to say, you've proven your quality, it's the very highest. So, and this is going to be true of basically all of the characters, they're all capable of overcoming their suspicions and not suspicions, but their failings. But unfortunately, Sam's failing maybe is what leads to Gollum's ultimate failing as a character, because Sam, being the hyper suspicious person that he is and everything else, he sees Gollum in a moment of actual tenderness, wakes up and sees him kind of like touching Frodo's knee, or nearly touching Frodo's knee. I think it was his knee anyway. And immediately suspects the worst, because that's just how he operates, and gets onto him and makes him, feel hurt. And Gollum then goes from, maybe I shouldn't murder my, my sworn master, to, yep, I'm totally killing him. So Sam's moral failings it does actually have an effect on the story, a very real one. And it's not clear where things would have gone had he not done that, but this is kind of Sam's thing. It's like his biggest flaw that we see in the story, at least. That's not to say that he doesn't have any other flaws, but this is the one that kind of really is prominent in the story. So that's Sam Gamgee for you. Next, let's take up Aragorn, who is very often taken up as kind of like the paragon character who has no flaws and is just awesome all around, and nothing is wrong with him. He's basically a Mary Sue. Well, no, he's actually not. And I've talked about this in videos before, where, especially comparing, say, Peter Jackson's Aragorn with the book version of the character, Peter Jackson very deliberately takes the Aragorn of the book and kind of inverts him a little bit and makes him into a character who is very averse to having power. And, it's a very Americanized or modernized way of looking at a character, because no character should ever want to have power. That's, kind of following on that old maxim of power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so anybody who wants power is necessarily dangerous. And there is certainly truth to that maxim, but in the story, Aragorn wants to be king, but it's for motives that are not related to him just getting power for its own sake. It's, he has to do that to get Arwen. It's kind of like it's like his Silmaril, if, you want to look at the Beren and Luthien parallel. But also, it's kind of his heritage and his destiny, at least seemingly. And so, his wanting power is not really his moral failing. Aragorn's moral failing in the book is actually that he does get a little bit prideful about it at times. And it's not to say that he's prideful about being, a king or having power exactly. It's actually just pride about his heritage in general. And the key moment where this comes up, at least for my money, is at the doors of Meduseld, because just before they enter, they're told that they have to basically put aside their weapons. And he, in the book, is carrying Andúril at this point. In the movie, of course, he's not, and so we skip this entirely. But at this stage in the book, he's actually carrying Andúril because it was reforged and given to him in Rivendell. So he's been carrying it all the way since then. And this is a sword that goes back to the First Age and was passed down from Elendil all the way in unbroken succession to him. And for him, it really is kind of a symbol of what, he's his people, who he is in a major sense. And so when he's told that he has to, give it up at the door, he's like, no, just not doing it. And, even Gandalf is like, Aragorn, this isn't going to solve any problems. You're not helping the situation. And he basically kind of digs his heel in and says, I wouldn't care who this person was that was telling me to do this if I was carrying any other sword but Andúril. And eventually, of course, he does give in, which, credit to him, he finally kind of sets his pride aside a little bit. Although he still, basically tells Hama, it's like, I'm going to put it by the wall, and if anybody touches it, you're dead. And, it's understandable in some sense why he might be this way about it. But I think it is also an example of him being a little extreme. Because, yes, it's an important sword. Yes, it's his heritage. Yes, it's all these things. Is it really worth being that, persnickety about? Because at the end of the day, it is a weapon. He is being asked to put it aside to enter the hall, which is something that everybody does. And, he really just kind of takes it too far, I think. So, this is kind of Aragorn's moral failing. Now, he does also have a little bit of self doubt, and it's arguable whether that's a moral failing or something else. If you wanted to argue it's a moral failing, we can see it multiple times. We can see it, hints of it at least in the trip between Bree and Rivendell, where he seems to be a little hesitant about things, but we especially see it after Gandalf's fall in Moria, and he just feels like everything he does is wrong, until he finally kind of turns that around after Boromir's death and says, okay, my heart speaks clearly at last. We chase after Merry and Pippin. And then after that, his confidence really seems to come back and whatnot, although we still see lingering hints of it whenever after everything is already won, he goes up into the slopes of Mindalluin and with Gandalf, and he basically tells Gandalf, I wish you were staying here because I'd like to have you around as an advisor. So he's still not 100% confident in his own ability, even though Gandalf has already said to somebody else, he's capable of taking his own counsel, and he's perfectly capable of just, handling his own stuff. So he also has some of that self-doubt. Now, again, you could argue whether that's a moral failing exactly, but if it is, that is another element. But the pride thing is the one that is clearly a moral failing, because he's really taking his I don't want to say pride in his heritage, because that's pride in a different sense, but at least his connection to it just too far, and making it more important and thus himself more important than it really should be. Now for another character that tends to get looked at by a lot of people as, basically perfect without any problems, and that's Faramir. And Faramir is my favorite character in the book. I find him just fascinating as a character study in all kinds of ways. And it's true, he does have very few obvious flaws in the story, but that's not to say that he doesn't have any. A lot of people look at Faramir and think, oh, he's just a perfect guy with no issues, because he turns down the ring flat without any hesitation, any struggle, anything. And therefore it's like, well, come on, this doesn't work but these people are missing how the ring actually works in the story. They're looking at this from the perspective of the way the ring acts in the movies, which is not accurate. So don't take that as a sign that Faramir is just perfect and has no flaws. It just means that the ring in the book acts a different way, okay? But Faramir has a lot of great qualities in the book. He is wise, he is sagacious, he is courageous, he is all kinds of things. And we're constantly told, and we see this from Baragon's perspective, kind of vicariously through Pippin, and also just from Pippin's perspective, how much his men love Faramir and would basically do or die for him in any circumstance. And this, of course, builds him up as this larger-than-life character in some ways, but he does have his problems, and chief among them, at least, and this is, again, one of those where we could say that maybe he has others, but this is the one that really comes through in the book. He has daddy issues. And when I say that, I don't mean like it's some weird psychological hang-up. I mean, Faramir cares too much about Denethor's opinion of him and his role as a son and a lesser officer, let's say, in the Gondorian hierarchy. And there's a sense in which this also kind of carries over into brother worship, because he also looks at Boromir as a very, somebody to admire. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. Certainly Boromir is admirable in a lot of respects that actually are admirable. And it's not like Faramir has this opinion of Boromir that is completely, just spotless, because he does recognize whenever Frodo kind of has to end up telling him what happened to Boromir and all this other stuff, or at least to the extent that Frodo knows, of course, he realizes, yeah, that kind of fits with the Boromir I know. He does have his issues. So it's not like he thinks of Boromir as somebody who's just on a pedestal perfect and doesn't have any flaws either. But there is probably some connection between this and the way he thinks of Denethor and what we see in the story. And admittedly, this is really subtle, and you have to read kind of between the lines to pick up on it. But Faramir, though he has his disagreements with Denethor, we do see that he really does want his father's approval, and he's willing to do things that are just nonsense, basically, to try to get it. Now, there's also an element of making sure that the hierarchy is what it is and not disobeying orders there, because it is also true that when Faramir goes and tries again to hold, the city of Osgiliath and the wall against the invading hordes of Mordor, he's not just doing it because it's his daddy who wants him to do it. He's also doing it because his daddy happens to be the steward of Gondor, who is literally basically the chief executive of the entire kingdom. And so he's also just obeying a superior's order. But we do, I think, get plenty of hints in the conversation that happens between him and Denethor and all the other captains of Gondor that what's going on here is more than just, obeying a superior's order. Because it seems like even the other captains are kind of like, man, Denethor, this is probably not such a good idea. And Denethor very kind of pointedly goes after Faramir when he says is there a captain here who will do his lord's will? In the movie we get that line as well, but Faramir is literally the only captain in the room. That's not what happens in the book. They're there with a council of people, and he delivers this line, and it's clear that he's trying to prod Faramir, and Faramir gives into it. When really, I mean, yes, he's his superior, but there is also a point at which perhaps Faramir was justified in saying, look, you're just using emotional blackmail, and this is unreasonable. I don't think this is a good idea. You're crazy. Probably listen to your counselors. But he doesn't. He just basically says, okay, since you're going to, twist my arm like that, I'll go do it. And part of it is also kind of like, we do get the line in the movie, which is also from the book, although I think the wording is a little different. It's like, since you were robbed of Boromir, I will do what I can in his stead. That's the movie line, basically. And you get the sense that he's doing that there too. And this idea that he's kind of making up for the fact that Denethor screwed up and sent Boromir on the wrong mission when he should have sent Faramir in the first place. It's like Faramir takes on Denethor's guilt, because it's really Denethor's fault, but Faramir basically takes on himself the repercussions of that. It's almost like he doesn't really see how twisted it is. Maybe he does, but I mean, he certainly doesn't voice anything about that. And this kind of semi-idolization of Denethor by Faramir, again, it's not to the point of being like, oh, my dad is perfect and nothing he does is wrong, but it does lead him to take actions that objectively are just, they don't really make sense. And we know that Denethor is basically using his own influence over Faramir, even though the funny thing is, Denethor's opinion of Faramir is that he is at best a tool to be used, and he doesn't think that much of him, which is kind of strange when you think about the fact that he then basically goads Faramir into being the one tool that he actually uses, to his own destruction, because when Faramir finally does come back almost dead, he then basically goes insane and wants to kill himself. So Denethor certainly has his problems there too, but Faramir's perspective on this, I think, is kind of from the moral failing of putting too much weight on what his father wants merely because he's his father. And, it's not just, there is the superior-inferior thing going on there too, like I said, but there are definitely hints in all those conversations that Faramir is doing it because he's his father, not necessarily because he's his superior. And now let's look at Gandalf, because Gandalf is another one of those characters who a lot of people tend to look at as being kind of semi-perfect. And, there's some justification for that because Gandalf is not merely a mortal. He is actually basically from, if you want to call it this, Tolkien might balk at the term, but an angel. And the idea here is that Gandalf is basically capable of no wrong because he is semi-divine. He's not, a mortal who's subject to all the problems that we have. But Gandalf does have his problems. And this is probably more due to the fact that he is incarnate in a body than because of just who he is, because it does place limitations on him that he wouldn't otherwise have. But Gandalf's big problem is basically being short fused, let's say, and a little bit not condescending exactly, but he certainly makes it clear that he doesn't always have a very high opinion of some of the people around him. One of the comments that comes to mind is that Gandalf will say at one stage, "I'm going to go and talk to the only person who's, the wisest person in the room, which is me." That's not exactly how he says it, but that's basically what he's saying is like, the rest of you are just not on my level, and I'm going to go, have a council with the smart person, which is myself. And it's funny when you think, and of course, part of this is said tongue-in-cheek. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Gandalf is that, arrogant about it. But there is a certain sense in which Gandalf does, because of his own superior knowledge and intellect and everything else, which he legitimately does have, he gets short with other people, and especially gets short with Pippin. Now, granted, there's plenty of good reasons to get short with Pippin, but he does tend to get just a little bit grumpy with everybody at some point. Gandalf will, snap at people and get frustrated and, just kind of not get mean exactly, but he will kind of bark and bite just a little bit about people who he thinks are being foolish. And he does it multiple times. Again, Pippin being the main recipient of said behavior. But it happens. And we can understand why, right? Because Gandalf really is that smart. And so he's surrounded by people who are nowhere nearly as intelligent as he is. He's going to have those kinds of reactions because it tends to try the patience. It really does. And if you've been in a scenario where you've been around people who are less competent than you at whatever, it doesn't have to be anything intellectual. It could be just, if you're a mechanic and you're looking at somebody just trying to fumble, trying to get a screw out, you're like, come on, let me just do it. And so it's a natural kind of thing, right? But Gandalf really does let it go pretty far sometimes. I mean, he will verbally abuse Pippin in ways that you could argue are him kind of engaging in the kind of thing that the hobbits engage in with themselves, what Coriolson calls hobbitry. They tend to kind of jokingly insult each other a lot, and you could argue that some of what Gandalf is doing is that. But there are also times when he does this with other characters. It's not like he only does it with Pippin, and he doesn't only even just do it with hobbits. I mean, he kind of gets a little bit short with other people too. Now, there's times when he has to avoid doing that, and he does. So again, it's not like this is something that he just always falls into and is terrible about. But it's one of those things where you can see Gandalf is not perfect. He's not... he does not have perfect patience. And I mean, who would in the trying situation that he's in? But again, this is one of those where Gandalf is kind of seen as being perfect because he's not just a human. But he does have those human failings because he is in a human body. Whether, that's not exactly who he is as an ontological matter. But nevertheless, he takes on some of those problems. And like humans, he can get hungry and thirsty and tired and all this other stuff. So it does come out from time to time that he finally just loses his patience. But, this is who Gandalf is. That's, more or less he's, on top of things, but every now and then has that moment where he's just like, I'm surrounded by idiots, and he just can't hold it back anymore. But this is, these are the four characters I wanted to look at. I mean, there's plenty other ones you could look at. And to kind of go back to something I said before, you can see how each of their flaws really connect to who they are and what they are in the story. So Gandalf, like I was saying, he loses his temper because he's so much smarter than everybody else that their stupidity just kind of grates on his nerves. Sam's provincialism comes kind of directly from his groundedness in who he is and where he's from. For the other two, look at Strider or Aragorn. His pride, again, really connects to who he is and what he sees his role is. It's, he has a sense of destiny about himself. And he also has a sense of, I have to do this in order to get what I want out of life, which is Arwen. And so for him, like, this is the ultimate part of who he is that's the most important in all the world. And so naturally it's going to take a little bit more room up in his mind than maybe it should, because it's so connected to not only his identity but also his goals. Faramir, this fits pretty well with Faramir because we know who he is just from his conversation with Frodo. He very much admires both his brother and his father, and that's not an uncommon thing to happen in anybody's life. If you have a father that's, let's forget about movie Denethor for a minute here, because movie Denethor is a joke. Movie Denethor is nothing like the real Denethor. That's not to say that book Denethor didn't have problems going way back, because he did, because he always felt like he was being overshadowed by, Thorongil, actually, or Aragorn. And so he always kind of had this chip on his shoulder, and he always mistreated Faramir. But one thing that tends to be true of, abusers is that their abuse victims kind of get, you probably know about the whole Stockholm Syndrome, but that tends to be a thing where an abuser gets actual love, affection, and respect from the abuse victim. And Faramir is basically that. He's kind of an emotional abuse victim. But also, stepping away from that, Denethor does have a lot of admirable qualities. In the book, now again, set aside movie Denethor, who is just crazy. Book Denethor is really smart, really brave, and does a lot in service of Gondor. Now, he also does a lot of it in service of himself, and by the end, that's his problem, is he is doing it really for him at the end of the day, because he just sees himself as being the most important thing in Gondor, and he's not going to hand it over to anybody else. He kind of looks at Gondor as his own little baby, as, he's basically kind of connected with it in a way that's not healthy. But in the book, it's made clear that Denethor is, he's actually very admirable in a lot of ways. And Pippin, in his own mind, when he and Gandalf are kind of sparring, sees the two of them and thinks to himself, Denethor actually seems the more kingly and wizardly on the outside. But Gandalf has something on the inside that Denethor ain't got. And so we get all these references to the fact that Denethor really does have a lot of good qualities. And so Faramir, growing up in this environment where he's kind of emotionally abused and made second string to Boromir, because Boromir is, the golden boy as far as Denethor is concerned, we could see why Faramir, being kind of an emotional abuse victim of a person who is legitimately a great person in a lot of ways, would have those kinds of hang-ups. It makes perfect sense. So when you look at all four of these characters and you look at their character flaws, they all fit perfectly well with their overall character, and how they all, all those traits fit together into a perfectly melded whole. So again, Tolkien is not writing one-dimensional characters who are just, perfectly good or perfectly bad and don't really have any nuance to them. No, if you look at it, these characters all have plenty of nuance, and everything fits. Tolkien actually knows what he's doing when he's writing a character. Now, that's not to say that he's writing the kind of completely fleshed out characters for all of these that you would in, different kinds of stories, because Tolkien is writing a mythology. He's writing a certain kind of story, and we get more fleshed out characters with Frodo and Sam than we do, say, with Aragorn and especially Faramir because he just has less time. But Aragorn is meant to be perceived as kind of a semi-legendary character, and we're not supposed to get all the nuances with Aragorn. That's not really the point. We get more of that with the hobbits because they're the ones that are kind of the main characters and through whom we see the story. But still, we see, if you pay attention to the characters, we get all this stuff. We get plenty of detail, enough to show that he really is thinking of them as holistic persons with real personalities and real strengths and weaknesses and all this stuff. So it's a really worthwhile thing to look at him in detail and get a sense of who they really are, and it explains so much of why they do what they do. So I wanted to talk about this for that reason, but also, again, just it's another rebuttal to that critique of Tolkien is just so, absolute white, absolute black. Yes, he does believe in absolute good and absolute evil, but his characters, none of them are at the polar end either way. So that was the main reason I wanted to make this video, and because it's just interesting to look at them in some detail. So hope you enjoyed that. Hope you learned something maybe that you didn't really think of before. If you did enjoy the video, make sure you like it and share it around. If you want to catch more of my content in the future, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and if you're on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions, and check the description for other social and support links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.